thank you to our speakers for spending the next hour with us. I'm AFPC Senior Vice President Ilan Berman. I head up all of our institutional research and analysis here at the American Foreign Policy Council, including our work on Islamism and Islamist thought and political currents in the Middle East. And this periodic webinar is part of a series to look at wars of ideas that are taking place within the Muslim world, the intellectual competition between Islamism and moderate political and religious currents in the Muslim world. And it's also an adjunct to an annual conference that we do called the Yearly Dialogue at the American Foreign Policy Council. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can log on to AFPC's website at www.afpc.org, and there's information there. We try periodically, every couple months or so, to supplement the conversation that we have at this benchmark annual event with conversations that we didn't manage to have during the live conference, or we didn't have enough of during the live conference. And so over the last few months, we've had webinars on things like Iranian strategy and political thought. We'd had a webinar on Turkey's evolving geopolitical trajectory and how it impacts its relations with the Muslim world. And today we're going to focus on a very fraught, very contentious issue, but the issue of the current war between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and both the strategy and the political underpinnings, as well as the ideological currents that permeate through it. It is very much top of mind, I think, for everybody like myself that focuses on the Middle East. It is, as I said, a fraught topic, but it's an enormously important one, because understanding the context within which this war is unfolding, both in the sense of Israeli society and in the sense of Palestinian society, is crucial to understanding what comes next. It's crucial to understanding how to shape US policy in a constructive fashion. So I'm delighted to welcome Jonathan Schanzer and Khalil Shikaki to dissect this for us in a much more expert way than I ever could. John is the executive director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies here in Washington, D.C. He's a former Treasury Department terrorism finance analyst. He's a prolific author and a noted expert on Middle East politics, and he's the author of 2 books on Palestinian politics, covering Palestinian governance and the political contest between Hamas and the Fatah faction of the PLO. Khalil Shikaki is the director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah, and he's also a senior fellow at Brandeis University's Crown Center for Middle East Studies. He is widely regarded as the preeminent Palestinian pollster, and since the start of the war, his center has been tracking Palestinian opinion closely. So I'm delighted to welcome you guys, and I want to start with, I'm a big believer in the fact that you have to understand where you were to understand where you're going. So I want to take us back a little bit. And I have a set of questions for each of you, but to all of our audience participants, the chat function is disabled, but the Q&A function is live. And if you have questions as our speakers give their thoughts, feel free to throw your questions into the Q&A function. I'll try to digest them, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible during the hour that we have together. So without further ado, let me start with my questions. Let me abuse the moderator's prerogative. And John, let me start with you. My assessment is that the current conflict is very much a moving target, but also the dimensions are not really fully understood, even by people who are close to it, even by watchers, by people who are watching it very diligently. You are among the ones that watch it the closest. So I wanted to talk to you about your assessment of where we stand, and have you walk us through the events leading up to October 7th, leading up to the Hamas terror campaign, and talk a little bit about Israeli strategy and what has transpired since then.
Okay, really simple question.
Sorry, sorry,
Glad you're
sorry.
kicking it off that way. No, first of all, thank you, Ilan, and great to appear here with Khalil, whose work is well known and I think very important in our attempts to understand what's going on in Palestinian society. And that's, of course, not an easy thing to do, certainly during the war and out of Gaza. That's, I mean, darn near impossible. But Khalil's still working at it, which is very laudable. Look, I think a few things to note as it relates to the lead up to the war. I think a lot of people have talked about this word concepcia, that Israel had started drinking its own Kool-Aid, reminiscent of the 1973 war, where Israelis were just convinced that they were so strong and impenetrable, and that specifically the enemy in Gaza was so weak and so unable to penetrate Israel that something like 10/7 was impossible. Um, I had this strange moment a few weeks before the attacks of 10/7, where I was actually talking to an Israeli official. I had just written a testimony on what was going on in the West Bank, which was where the Israelis had been focusing their attention. They had been warning of a possible blowup. They had warned that Hamas was really investing more money and weapons and fighters and infrastructure in the West Bank. And that's where the attention was. So I had written testimony about that. I actually called an Israeli official who I knew just to sort of find out whether there's anything that I was missing on the eve of the testimony. Just because, sometimes you just don't pick things up if you haven't been in a little while. As we all know, you kind of need to be on the ground to hear what folks are saying and to get a sense of whether they're even buying what they're selling. So I talked to this one official who's quite close, as I understand it, to Netanyahu, or at least he was before 10/7. And we talked about the West Bank for, 45 minutes about all the different threats and Abbas being, 19 years into a 4-year term and, the sort of corruption and pay for slay and all the different issues that members of Congress here were going to be concerned about. And as we wrapped up, I said, you didn't mention Gaza once. Um, Anything I need to know about Gaza there? And the this official said to me, no, actually, we're feeling very optimistic about Gaza. We believe that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, is someone who is pragmatic, and this is somebody that we can work with. And I said, well, that doesn't sound like Sinwar, and it doesn't sound like Hamas, but good luck. Glad that's going well, but kind of just said that just seems odd. It just didn't feel like a truthful narrative. Now, I mean, I will say I think I bought in myself to the overall assessment that Hamas was a tactical threat. And yet here we are now, nearly 600 days later, and they've thrust the Middle East into a 7-front conflict. They're not a tactical threat, or at least they were not on October 6th and October 7th. Now I think they're essentially defeated. It doesn't mean they're not going to continue to fight at a low level. We still see rockets and we still see shooting attacks and bombings and booby traps that are killing Israeli soldiers. But I mean, I see this organization as a shell, as a shadow of what it once was. And I don't see the organization posing a significant threat to Israel in years to come. I just don't see it. And that does raise the question of what Israel's looking to accomplish here. And I think right now, uh, in short, the answer is I'm not sure. We got reports this morning that Israel now controls 50% of the Gaza Strip. And they control all of the surrounding borders around the Gaza Strip. They've got corridors that cut, across east-west across the Gaza Strip, which means that they can penetrate easily. They can strike at will against threats as they emerge. It's total domination here. The question I think really remains, what is it that they're trying to drive at the end of the day? Is it just the full and complete ouster of Hamas? That will likely require some diplomatic wrangling. Is it a surrender? That I think would be probably useful. I think, having total victory, as it were, where Hamas acknowledges its own defeat, that sounds useful to me, but I'm not sure that Hamas is willing to do so. Even with, Mohammed Sinwar recently being, I mean, at least we believe he's dead. Yahya Sinwar gone, most of the top leadership gone. But I just still, I think the challenge that remains right now is that this is an organization that doesn't care about subjecting 1.8 or 2 million people to additional suffering. They're fighting for a cause, they're fighting for an ideology. And I just don't see the surrender coming anytime soon. So, at what point does Israel say, we're going to declare victory anyway, because we need to move on to other things? And I think that's kind of what I'm watching for right now out of Israel. I'll end there.
No, thank you, John. That's a great scene setter, certainly from the Israeli side. And I'm struck by your point about the conceptia, the sort of the flawed assumptions. And I think you hit upon something very important, because I had the same sense in my conversations with Israeli officials, that there was this increasing appetite to think about an ideological actor as a political actor. Think about the fact that, things were sort of trending towards normalization in a way that would leach the ideological fervor away from Hamas. And in retrospect, this was, I think, a very profound misreading. But Khalil, so precisely there, I think it's important, because we know in the fullness of time, sort of looking backwards, that there was a misunderstanding of Hamas ideology, misunderstanding of Hamas motivations. What was the Palestinian scene looking like on October 6th, October 7th, and then how has it evolved from there?
Thank you. Thank you, Ilan. And good to be with you. Good to be with you, John. And I'm delighted we have this conversation. I think that one needs to understand Hamas's logic in order to understand what happened on that day. And I think Hamas, soon after it took over Gaza violently in 2007, found that it had three options in dealing with its predicament. One is to turn Gaza into a mini state. And I think this might have been feasible, particularly in 2012, when Morsi came to power in Egypt. And this would have worked very well with Netanyahu's strategy, where he wanted a separation between the West Bank and Gaza, and a Hamas mini state in Gaza would have certainly been a good idea. From an Israeli perspective, it would have killed the two-state solution. I would imagine that would have been the logic. And the second choice would be to reintegrate back into the Palestinian Authority. I think this idea in particular was triggered most importantly by Sisi when he became president and destroyed the lifeline that Hamas has had in the tunnels underneath the border. Once these tunnels were destroyed, Hamas no longer really had that option of having a mini state of its own, and reintegration became the goal of Hamas. And I think when Abbas canceled the elections in 2021, he basically killed that idea. Hamas came to the conclusion this option is not realistic. And the third option was for Hamas to throw its weight completely with the axis of resistance, work closely with Iran, and take the risks involved, but without losing control over Gaza. And I think these three options were more or less being debated and discussed over time. And after 21, I believe the idea that gained ground within certain Hamas circles, certainly Sinwar, was the third idea. It was not a suicidal mission. I don't think Sinwar was thinking of suicide. I think he was thinking of a limited war that could then move things politically and open up other options, including victory for the axis of resistance, if the axis of resistance is to show up in a forceful manner. So I think it was calculated. The timing, I think, had to do with, first, the domestic Israeli environment and the attention. John was absolutely right. Gaza was not on the Israeli radar. And the focus was on the West Bank or on the judicial revolution that Israel was involved in. And with all of that, of course, the division in Israeli society. And I think Hamas saw this as an opportunity. And I think there were two other factors that contributed to this. One is domestic for Hamas. In July, just 3 months before October, there were demonstrations in Gaza against Hamas. This was not the first time that there were demonstrations by youth, in particular against Hamas. There were several occasions since 2007. And I think this time, however, it was clearly evident for Hamas that it does not really have an answer to these people who want improved living conditions. Netanyahu was not willing to give Hamas what it wanted. He was willing to give it a few crumbs here and there, not enough, I believe, for Hamas to be able to satisfy the demand. And I think there was a third factor. That third factor, I think, is the one where the axis of resistance as a whole was interested in, which is to block Saudi normalization with Israel. These three issues, I think, determined that this was a good time for Hamas to do what it did on October the 7th. But I think this was not an irrational conclusion. I think Sinwar certainly did not anticipate the great success he would have. Given what happened on that day, the complete absence of the Israeli army from the border that led to such a devastating blow. I think he certainly did not expect that. And I believe he expected a limited engagement that would end up with some sort of a dialogue with Hamas on how to organize Hamas-Israel relations that would end up either with the reintegration option or with the mini-state option. And if none of that works, then he could stay with the axis of resistance. I think these are the issues that were on Hamas's mind on that day. Today, looking at all of that, obviously we are facing a situation where it really doesn't seem to be any kind of sustainable outcome for what is going on right now. If you look at the three main actors, that is Abbas, let's begin with Abbas, Hamas and Israel, you can clearly see that the PA remains, even today, relatively paralyzed. It has no initiative. It thinks this is how it can survive. In the short term, I think this might serve the interests of the ruling elite within the PA, but it doesn't serve the interests of the Palestinian people. As a result, the PA has lost the trust of the Palestinian public since October the 7th, certainly before that, but since October the 7th, things have gotten much worse. It is not taken seriously by the Israelis. Instead of reunifying the Palestinian ranks, create a single leadership to negotiate with Israel the end of the war, and confront settler violence in the West Bank, which has increased almost fourfold since October the 7th, it has decided to distance itself from what happened since October the 7th, because it did not want to associate itself with what happened. It did not want to associate itself with Hamas by creating a unified leadership, for example. It did not want to go to elections, which would have been the price for reunification and the reintegration of Hamas into the Palestinian political system. And it is more or less abdicated responsibility in the West Bank, responsibility for ensuring law and order, allowing armed groups in the northern parts of the West Bank, but also allowing settlers to rampage in Palestinian areas that are under its own control. It could have deployed police to protect these communities. It did not. For Hamas, I think the fighting today is for its own survival, and it will continue to do so. I agree with John. I don't think it will surrender, regardless of the cost. I think the price it is now paying, and this is based on the surveys that we are conducting both in Gaza and the West Bank, is that the majority of Gazans no longer think it can win the war. Half of Gazans want it removed from government, and half of Gazans say they want to leave Gaza. These are findings that are really devastating for Hamas. Nonetheless, its only chance of survival is to continue the fight, even if it continues for months or years to come. Israel continues to fight, I believe, a losing battle that will likely end when it has a new government or perhaps a new prime minister, maybe in late 26. If it faces today, Israel faces today the same challenges it faced on day one when it entered Gaza. The only way to control it is by fully reoccupying it and take the risk of having to face a long-term insurgency. I agree with John that Hamas's military capacity has been more or less destroyed, but Israel will continue to bleed in blood, in treasure, in international isolation. Since Israel is controlled by a prime minister who's fighting for his own personal political survival, he could not and probably cannot end this war and cut Israel's losses. So Israel has two other options than that. It could end the war, leave Hamas in control. The advantage is that such a step avoids having a political price in the form of a two-state solution. While Israel was willing to do this, I believe, in the past, as I said, before October the 7th, it simply can't do that after October the 7th. The second alternative is to agree to a long-term comprehensive deal along the lines of a two-state solution that would allow a transitional Palestinian government to resume control over Gaza, but also force Hamas to disarm. Israel cannot do that while the current government is in place. So I can't see Israel being able to move out of Gaza anytime soon or in the war. And in the West Bank, I think the current creeping annexation is going to continue to speed up. It seems the goal is to bring the PA to bankruptcy and eventual collapse and to annex the larger part of the West Bank, or as much as it could get away with, whenever the opportunity presents itself. In other words, I think it seems to me that the conflict is not just with Hamas, but the conflict is with the entire Palestinian people. And it is no longer a conflict over the separation of the two peoples into two separate states. It's now more existential.
Well, let me jump in right there, because I think that's a crucial point. The second set of questions that I had for both of you deals with exactly this, deals with perception and with ideology. And so, John, let me kick it back to you, and let me sort of ask you, from your understanding, from your multiple visits to Israel, how has Israeli society changed in terms of attitudes towards both towards the potential of a two-state solution, which is very much, as you know, very much bandied about here as a term of art. Does that have any salience there? How do they see the future of relations with the Palestinians?
It's not a particularly rosy outlook here. I mean, let's be frank. You know, they sort of talk about the October 6th versus October 8th mentality. You hear that a lot, right? And the October 6th mentality was, hey, we can work with Sinwar and we can be pragmatists and we can, offer a kind of a roadmap for Hamas to, perhaps start to evolve and to change and to, provide more for the Palestinians of Gaza. It's funny that you want to talk about kind of public opinion. There's one thing, literally one thing in Israel that no one wants to be. And the word is a friar. And that means somebody who's a sucker, someone who got taken by someone else. You don't want to be a friar in business deals, in diplomatic deals. You just don't want to yield to your interlocutor, let's say. It's not even adversary or enemy. I mean, it could be somebody on the street. You don't let a car get in front of you, right? Because, well, you let them go. That's not okay, right? This is sort of the mentality. And now imagine that with the stakes being, the survival of the Jewish state, which, I mean, I will say when Israel fought a 7-front war, now it's not 7 fronts any longer. It's sort of 2.5, maybe, I guess. But there was a sense that this was Israel's second war of independence and that nothing less than total victory was required. And so I think that the two-state solution idea, whatever credence it had before October 7th, which was not a lot, people had already started to sour on this, I mean, dating back all the way to the Second Intifada. I mean, really 2001, I think, was probably the body blow that really knocked out the two-state solution even back then. And it's been on life support for 20 plus years. The Israeli left has held on to it, but I got to say it's harder and harder right now for the Israeli left to articulate anything that comes close to two-state solution discussion right now. I just don't see it. So right now the left is trying to make some kind of a comeback, and they're trying to do it over the, on the back of Netanyahu, knowing that he's, in trouble politically if he ends the war, knowing that he is ultimately going to be saddled with some responsibility for what happened on October 7th. There's been an attempt to resuscitate the two-state solution. I don't see a lot of traction for it right now. The discussion right now is about Israel's borders, as they need to be, as they should be. From the Israeli perspective, it's about the weapons, it's about the new defense posture that is going to be needed to be fighting these wars for many years to come. I think that, look, if you ask me what is the trajectory of the two-state discussion, there can be no serious discussion right now while the war is still happening. That seems, I think, to me, just blatantly obvious. When the war does end and, we see some kind of calm prevail, that's where discussions can resume. But, the October 8th mentality that I referenced, this is about not trusting your enemy, not allowing your enemy to tell you the narrative any longer, not giving them just even a modicum of agency if they are still your enemy. And I think that for me, there's one thing that changes that dynamic right now, and that is the exit of Mahmoud Abbas from the scene. The guy's getting up there. He's no spring chicken, as we say. And he's been kind of an absentee leader for, I mean, decades now. He's really been nowhere to be found. I think new leadership coming in, pragmatic leadership, moderate leadership, people that mark a significant shift from where we have been. And by the way, I will say full credit to Abbas. He ended the violence after the Second Intifada broke out, and he's not resumed it. But he's not exactly been an agent for peace either. So I do think a break in leadership may yields a different direction of this discussion. But I got to say, I am just overall not sanguine based on what I'm hearing out of Israel. They're still in war mode. And when you're in war mode, you're not making peace and you're not making concessions. And so, I think we need to wait till the end of this conflict and then see what comes out of the new leadership. Those are the only paths that I can see right now that lead to a more conciliatory position from the Israelis.
No, I think that's very apt, and it dovetails precisely with what I wanted to ask Khalil, which is you started in your initial answer, you started to unpack the findings of your surveys, you know, what the Palestinians think in terms of identification, in terms of attitudes, both towards Hamas and towards the Palestinian Authority itself. And you know, to John's point, there's a sense of drift on the part of the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian sentiment towards the PA. So unpack that for us a little bit. You know, what are you finding? What are you seeing in terms of right now, right? What, 18, 19 months into the war? What are you seeing in terms of Palestinian sentiment? How do they feel about Hamas? How do they feel about the Palestinian Authority? What do they see coming down the pike?
Well, there are developments related to how the public thinks about the issues that are similar to what's happening in the Israeli society, and there are things that are different. And this affects the various issues. The question of, for example, what is the aim of what Israel is doing now? What is Israel's long-term goals? The perception that Israel is committing genocide, that the goal is expulsion, whether it is West Bank or Gaza, and the justification for what happened on October the 7th. These are all things in which the Palestinians and Israeli Jews share in terms of their perception of the other side. Where we see differences with the Israelis is on the matter of the two-state solution. We do see significant retreat by the Israeli public from supporting the two-state solution. This is not what we see among the Palestinian public. I think what I just said about the perception of genocide and expulsion is leading the Palestinians to view the Palestinian state within the context of a two-state solution as an asset, one that could protect against such threat of genocide and expulsion. And so we do see significant change among the Palestinian public in favor of a two-state solution. Now, it is true that, having talked about the two-state solution, that I must say that even the surveys that we have done jointly with Tel Aviv University have indicated that both societies, while they agree with John right now, they are extremely angry at each other. When you present them with a scenario that meets their most vital needs, they are willing to change, significantly change. In a single survey, you could see how they are hurt, how they are angry, and how they are becoming hardline. But at the same time, in response to incentives that meet their vital needs, they do change dramatically and support deals along the lines of a two-state solution, even today, while the war is ongoing. So that indicates that the shifts in public opinion that have happened since October the 7th are certainly not the kind of shifts that are solid, that are driven by ideological convictions. There are more shifts that are driven by anger and threat perception. And so when they feel that there is a way out of this misery, there seems to be willingness on both sides to show support for that. On the domestic front, just like in Israel, Netanyahu has lost it, Abbas is exactly in the same position, where the Palestinian public sees, in the case of Netanyahu, of course, his responsibility, but in the case of the Palestinians, his inaction, his inability to lead the process of ending the war, of delivering humanitarian services, unifying the ranks, negotiating on behalf of the Palestinians instead of allowing an organization to negotiate. For all of these reasons, I think the future of Abbas is essentially set. He does not really have any chance of leading the Palestinians through elections. And there must be a new Palestinian leadership if we are to see serious engagement in any kind of resumption of negotiations. Hamas is not in a better shape. In some respect, yes, it is in the West Bank in particular, but in Gaza, Hamas is in deep trouble. Its popularity has, which increased dramatically in the West Bank, has decreased significantly since October the 7th. The perception that Hamas will win the war, this is particularly important for Gazans, has dramatically changed. With a small minority now believes it will win the war. Even among its own supporters and those who share its values, a significant part of those also think it will not win the war. The demand, we saw them, we asked about the demonstrations against Hamas, and we see clearly that half of Gazans support these demonstrations, even though those who participate, of course, is a small number. But I think there is support for the goals of the demonstrators. The reason people are not participating is, I don't think it is fear of Hamas, but I think it's fear of the unknown, fear that if Hamas is gone, then who is going to be able, in the absence of an alternative to Hamas, to ensure some kind of order in Gaza, some kind of orderly humanitarian and delivery and so on. So for these reasons, I think Hamas is indeed in trouble. But we don't see the kind of demand for alternatives other than a Palestinian one. We don't see any kind of support or a very, very limited support for engagement with other Arab actors, whether it is in governance roles or in security roles. What the Palestinians want is to see a national unity government, not a political one, but of technocrats, but with a strong prime minister who is independent of Fatah or Hamas or Abbas, someone who can, on a transitional basis, lead a transitional government to end the war, to begin reconstruction, to prepare for elections. That's where they are today. So Hamas's gamble on October the 7th has not been able to deliver to it what it hoped it could deliver. The only bright thing that seems to be coming out of all of this is the Palestinian return to supporting a permanent peace with Israel based on a two-state solution.
So this conversation is heading exactly where I wanted to go, because this was precisely what I was going to ask you, John, which is the Israelis just a couple of weeks ago, they announced a new phase in the conflict, right? They announced a new offensive to sort of regain the momentum in what seems like a strategy, an offensive that's been drifting a little bit. But zoom out a little bit, take the longer view. You had talked about the fact that, the strategic objectives seem murky, but to your best assessment, how are the Israelis seeing this? What are they seeking to achieve? And most importantly, right, at least since we're sitting in Washington, how are they trying to balance this with what they expect to come out of Capitol Hill and to come out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in terms of American policy towards the region?
Look, I see right now a lot of dissonance, and I've got to be, I got to be blunt here. I see an Israeli population, 70% are opposed to the war at this point. They want the war to end. They want a deal that sees the release of all the hostages in exchange for an end of conflict. They've been fighting for almost 600 days. They're exhausted, and they want their hostages back. I mean, that is, that is a key objective of the Israeli public. And that's not right or left. I mean, yeah, you've got a sort of a religious right that is, kind of the religious nationalists who are, they're the hardcore fighters in the IDF, and they're sort of the backbone of all of this. And I think they're, more focused on the destruction of Hamas, but you've got the broader public that is saying, look, this thing's run its course. So I see some dissonance there in terms of Israeli public opinion, Israeli policy. Then I think there's the dissonance that comes from the kind of U.S. policy or lack thereof and Israeli policy, right? I mean, what you have from the Israeli perspective is, I mean, they were flat on their backs militarily. They fought their way back up to their knees, and now they're standing pretty tall, having defeated Iran on multiple fronts. Maybe not permanently, but certainly they gained the edge in the vast majority of the fronts where they were fighting. And then Trump comes in, and I think the essential assumption was Trump's going to give them full backing. And I think on Gaza, they got that backing up to a point. I mean, I did get the sense that at least in the beginning, when Trump just said, "Bibi, do what you want in Gaza," that Bibi was kind of like the dog that caught the mailman. Like, okay, well, now what? And I think we saw a period of a couple of months where, at least from my understanding, that's when the IDF went back and figured out, okay, what does a full-blown invasion of Gaza look like? And that's what's playing out right now. But as it's playing out, you're beginning to see the administration saying, wait a minute, we're a little bit uncomfortable about, delivery of aid and humanitarian issues. And that's beginning to echo a little bit of what we heard from the Biden administration, which, that's what a lot of people were upset about. They thought that the Biden administration was kind of putting their finger on the scale in ways that were maybe harming Israel's military progress. So I see some dissonance there. And then, of course, there is the dissonance over, the U.S. Decision to halt its operations against the Houthis, the decision to engage with Iran diplomatically as opposed to, maybe engaging directly militarily, which I think Bibi had hoped for on some level. And so when you ask me what the Israelis are thinking as it relates to 1600 Pennsylvania, I think the shorthand for it is WTF. I think they don't know, right? There's a lot of moving parts right now. I think some of that actually also has to stem from the debate that is playing out within the White House right now between so-called internationalists versus neo-isolationists or China firsters. I mean, this sort of question of whether this war in the Middle East is even worth the attention or the munitions of the United States. So there's some interesting stuff playing out there as well. But I think that when we look at the broader trajectory of the war, with all of that said, all of the confusion, I would say that Israel right now is looking to press its advantage on multiple fronts. I think the Israelis understand that force at the end of the day is still the thing that matters the most, pushing Israel's enemies into a corner, giving them fewer options, less room to maneuver, that this is going to yield them the political advantage that they seek in the overall. I mean, the thinking that I've heard coming out of the IDF and the military, or security apparatus in Israel is that the map has fundamentally changed, and they want to secure those changes. You've got weaker enemies that are receding. In some cases, they've lost territory. In other cases, they've lost massive amounts of fighters and weapons. This is something that the Israelis want to lock in, and they're not interested in negotiating with anybody right now until they've achieved those war aims. And, this is not going to be easy stuff, right? This is going to be really difficult things to watch, brutal wars playing out, brutal decisions being made that don't necessarily comport with popular opinion, not in Israel, not in the Palestinian arena, or other countries around the region as well, if not the United States. So a lot happening here that is really more about hard power and a lot less about the rest.
No, that's I think that's a great summation, and while not a particularly rosy picture, I think it's a pretty accurate one. So that leads me to Khalil, to pick up where you left off in terms of Palestinian attitudes, because it speaks directly to what what I'm trying to get at, which is what are we looking at in the future? You laid out, I think, very compellingly that at least the survey data suggests that Hamas is diminished, if not totally discredited, that the Palestinian Authority is far closer to being totally discredited because of its inaction. But what are the alternatives in the Palestinian arena? What do the Palestinians want moving forward? Are they looking to the Gulf? Are they looking to Iran and the axis of resistance? What is the sort of, which direction are they turning for support and for sort of a vision of the future?
There is no doubt that they are looking for the international community for support. I think they realize that this war also provides an opportunity where Israel is being isolated. There is greater attention to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is the time, perhaps, where the international community could play a role in facilitating some sort of an agreement on constraining Israel's behavior and so on. That's, I think, because they no longer expect Hamas to be able to transform the situation, and they don't believe that the Palestinian Authority is likely to engage in any kind of political reform that is meaningful. They do want to see that reform, but they do understand that is not likely to happen anytime soon. In my own assessment, I think that is absolutely correct. I think the only chance that we will see reforms, serious reforms within the Palestinian Authority, is if there is a diplomatic process that is viable, that is moving towards a political solution to the conflict. Only when that becomes a reality, I believe we might then see some willingness on the part of the ruling elite within the Palestinian Authority to take the kind of risks that they are being asked to take by the Palestinian public and by the region and the international community. What I see, however, is the continued weakening of the Palestinian Authority. As Israel, as John said, is moving forward with the goals that do not involve any kind of dialogue with the Palestinians. To the contrary, this government is doing its best to weaken the Palestinian Authority and bring it to bankruptcy. That bankruptcy, however, could have very serious consequences. Right now, what is preventing the eruption of large-scale violence in the West Bank is the continued existence of that Palestinian Authority and its security services. They have no interest in any kind of military or violent explosion in the West Bank, despite the Israeli army behavior in the northern part of the West Bank and the displacement of tens of thousands of Palestinians and the destructions of homes and so on. And despite the settler violence, the Palestinian Authority has a great deal of interest in preventing any eruption of large-scale violence in the West Bank. But if the Palestinian Authority becomes bankrupt, financially that is, and if that means it will not be able to pay salaries, that means the ability of the security services to continue to exist as a reliable force will then vanish. Under these conditions, there could be significant for the formation of armed groups. I'm not saying necessarily a kind of intifada, but we could see significant eruption of violence that then could provide an environment where those in Israel, particularly among the national religious groups, to try and bring the Gaza war into the West Bank in the hope that this would create conditions that could perhaps facilitate the annexation of significant parts of the West Bank.
So at the risk of sort of opening a larger conversation, I always like to sort of to try to end these things with a little bit of a glimmer of hope. And what I'm hearing, the thread that I'm hearing is we're in a very difficult situation. And it's a situation made more difficult by entrenched opinion and also by diminishing political legitimacy, right? And sort of in varying degrees, depending on which groups you're talking about. But I guess to both of you, so my closing question would be, is that alternative leadership in evidence, right? President Trump, when he talked a couple months ago, he talked about sort of the resettlement. He talked about sort of a concept that was, I think, more of a concept than a plan, right? To be fair. But he should be credited for changing the conversation, for having the conversation sort of take a little bit of a different turn in terms of thinking anew about the future of the Israeli-Palestinian confrontation. And so I'm going to charge you guys with trying to do the same thing, just in the couple of minutes that we have remaining. Where does that new leadership come from? Where does that international process come from? Is that driven by the United States? Is that driven by the Gulf? Obviously, somebody needs to take the first step, because I think it's very clear that we are heading into a sort of, for a protracted conflict, we're heading into another period of not quick resolution, and leadership is needed. So, John, conceivably, where would this come from?
Look, I think a couple things going on here right now. One is you got the disruptor in chief throwing curveballs at everybody, calling for, the construction of Gaza Lago, and, starting a conversation about, reconstruction and investment, and, potentially even annexation of the Gaza Strip by the United States. And that sends everybody into a tailspin. And by the way, I think in potentially a good way, because I do believe that thinking out of the Arab world as it relates to dealing with the manufactured refugee crisis. Now there's a real one, but there was a manufactured one for many years that I think, needed to be addressed. And maybe it's being addressed now, maybe it's not, but it definitely started to get the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Saudis and others to start to think about, how to reconstruct, what it all means, what to do with the population of Gaza in the interim. And it really began to slaughter some sacred cows, right? This idea, this is sclerotic thinking dating back to, original Arab League meetings in the aftermath of the creation of the state of Israel, that no Palestinian should ever leave Palestinian territory, even amidst suffering, even amidst wars, that they need to remain living symbols of their cause at all costs. And now all of a sudden, you've got utter destruction in the Gaza Strip, and you've got people now talking about, temporary transfer of populations, thinking about what government looks like after Hamas. These are important things. Now, I don't want to say that there has been a plan that I think will be accepted, because I think so far they've all struck out on lots of different levels. This latest one by the French and the Saudis together, suggesting that that Hamas would have a possible role in future governance in the Gaza Strip. That, as I joked this morning on my podcast, that's going to go over about as well as a bikini model at the Western Wall. It's just simply, it's not going to fly in Israel. There's just no way that they're going to buy into that. But I do think that right now we are seeing some signs of at least a willingness to engage in conversation that I would describe as more flexible. Maybe not as flexible as I want to see, but there is a conversation that's happening. And I will just say that this hard power approach that the Israelis are taking, I actually think there is some logic here. And I don't want to give too much credit to Netanyahu. I don't know if that's what he's doing, if that's his intention. But I would say that the more he charges ahead and refuses to back down, the more the Arab world, the more the Europeans, and maybe even the United States are going to realize we're going to have to come up with another solution here. We cannot keep going back to the same tired kind of two states and leave everybody there. And, let's just work with the same paradigm that we were working with before. They're breaking stuff, right? They are actually tearing down structures that have not served us well for quite a long time. And they're forcing people to think about alternatives. Again, I have not yet seen an alternative that works, and there are going to be those who continue to say there is no alternative. This is the only paradigm. I'm going to disagree with that, but I also have to say I'm waiting for the plan that everybody buys into that is actually a solution to the short-term problem of what to do with these, hundreds of thousands, more than 1.5 million Gazans who need alternative lodging. They need a different solution for what's happened in this territory. And then there's that longer term question of what do we do about the two-state issue, and is that still viable?
Excellent. And Khalil, how do you see, same question, how do you see things evolving?
I agree that the region today has become critical. Unlike all previous bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and engagement, this in the last decade, the region has changed. We do see significant willingness on the part of the major Arab countries to play a role and not leave the Israeli-Palestinian issue to Palestinians and Israelis. I think the region seems to be really highly interested in playing a constructive role in facilitating finding a solution. It has two problems, however. This is not the kind of Israel that they hoped would be a partner for that. This is a new Israel controlled by national religious groups and extremists who are certainly are not going to be partners to what the Arab, the region, and particularly the major Arab countries, including the Saudis, who would be expected to play that central role in facilitating Israeli-Palestinian peace. And the second impediment that is now, that they now see clearly, is that the Palestinian leadership is unwilling to allow the emergence of a new leadership that would be willing to be pragmatic and to engage with the region and with the Israelis and gain the kind of support from the Palestinian and legitimacy from the Palestinian public. This, of course, would be transitional, but it would be one that would have a strong leader, a prime minister who's independent of Abbas. That's what they need in order to be able to engage seriously with the Palestinians, and they can't find it. So if they can't find what they need to find among Israelis and similarly among Palestinians, they seem to basically left to work with the international community. That is, of course, worthwhile. It's good that the international community is being brought into this as well. Everyone wants to see an end to the conflict in the international community. But unless the Palestinians and Israelis are also willing to engage and participate in this seriously, nothing is likely to come out of that. And so I wish I can be more optimistic about the prospect. I don't see how we can see ourselves out of it. Theoretically, we know how to get out of it. But I see the major impediments, both in Israel and within the Palestinian leadership, as things that we are not going to be able, neither will the region be able to tackle, at least in the short term.
Well, I think John had a slightly more optimistic view than you, but you know what? I'll take it. Thank you guys for a difficult conversation, but I think a very necessary one about sort of where we were, where we are, and where we're potentially going. So thank you all, and thank you all for watching. If you're interested in learning more about our work on Middle East politics, including this issue and many others, visit us online at www.afpc.org. Thank you until we have another one of these. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.